The Saharan heat was a physical weight, a shimmering curtain of gold that threatened to collapse the lungs of anyone foolish enough to stand still. Elias Thorne, however, was not standing still. He was standing on the edge of a miracle. The Sif Ammon sinkhole had appeared after a series of seismic tremors that had rattled the Algerian border, appearing from the air like a black pupil in a sea of red sand. For Elias, a man whose life was measured in atmospheres of pressure and the narrow beam of a Petzl headlamp, it was the find of a century. He had spent 3 weeks at the surface, his base camp a model of modern efficiency. Solar panels hummed, satellite uplinks chirped, and his racks of gear, redundant regulators, double steel tanks, and carbon fiber backplates, stood like sentinels in the dust. He was meticulous, a man who checked his O-rings 4 times and cross-referenced his decompression tables until the numbers blurred. The entrance was a narrow vertical fissure that dropped into a subterranean aquifer. The transition was jarring. One moment, the air was 115 degrees Fahrenheit and bone dry. The next, he was sliding into crystalline water, a startling, impossible blue that suggested a massive, untapped reservoir deep beneath the desert floor. On the first day of the actual exploration, everything was textbook. He checked his nitrox levels, calibrated his computer, and slipped into the cool embrace of the water. The limestone walls were smooth, ivory-colored, and scalloped by ancient flows. It looked like any other karst system in the world, until he hit the 200-foot mark. Elias passed through a narrow restriction, a squeeze that required him to unclip one of his side-mounted tanks to shimmy through. On the other side, the cave changed. This wasn't the work of water. The passage ahead was perfectly hexagonal, the walls carved with a geometric precision that defied the natural chaos of geology. The silt on the floor was undisturbed, white as bone meal, and so fine that even a stray flick of a fin would have blinded him for an hour. He used a modified frog kick, gliding with surgical care. In the center of this hexagonal hall stood an altar of dark volcanic basalt. At the 4 corners of the altar were deep depressions, reservoirs that still held the clotted, resinous remains of ancient oil, preserved for centuries in the oxygen-free depths. Elias panned his primary light upward. The wall behind the altar had been smoothed into a tablet. Carved in a script that looked like a jagged hybrid of Latin and some forgotten Berber dialect were 5 distinct lines. Elias pulled his underwater slate and transcribed them, his breath echoing in the rhythmic whoosh hiss of his regulator. 1. Offer no light to the shadows. The eye that sees too much is the first to be taken. 2. Speak only in the tongue of the stone. The breath of man is a trespass. 3. Carry the weight of the fallen. The unburdened soul floats to the ceiling of glass. 4. Do not look upon the golden weaver. The thread of life is easily tangled. 5. Descent is the only absolution. The path behind is a memory of dust. Elias snorted into his mask, a burst of silver bubbles tickling his ears. It reminded him of the cultist legends of the 14th century, the Ordo Umbrae, a heretical sect that fled the Inquisition, rumored to have sought a god of the deep in the burning wastes of the Sahara. He checked his gas. He had plenty. He kicked his fins, aiming for the dark maw of the tunnel leading deeper. After 30 minutes of mapping a corridor that seemed to stretch into infinity, Elias decided to call the dive. He was a conservative diver. The one-third rule was his Bible. 1/3 of his gas to get in, 1/3 to get out, and 1/3 for emergencies. He turned 180 degrees to head back to the altar room. But the hexagonal tunnel was gone. In its place was a jagged, twisting labyrinth of silt-choked fissures that he had never seen before. He checked his compass. The needle was spinning aimlessly, a frantic silver blur. Panic, the cave diver's silent killer, began to prickle at his fingertips. He tried 3 different tunnels, each time moving faster, his breathing rate climbing until the roar of his regulator was all he could hear. Each tunnel, no matter the direction, deposited him back into the altar room. The carvings on the wall seemed deeper now, as if the stone were exhaling, the jagged letters pulsing with a faint internal heat. "Descent is the only absolution," he whispered into his regulator. The path back was gone. The cave had changed the locks behind him. Elias descended into a vertical shaft that felt like the throat of a giant. As he dropped, the blue water turned a murky, bruised purple. The silence of the deep was replaced by a low-frequency hum that he felt in his teeth. He realized he was humming, a nervous habit to keep his heart rate down. Suddenly, the water around him began to vibrate. From the walls, pale, translucent shapes began to emerge. They weren't fish. They looked like the vestigial remains of human faces, stretched thin like wet parchment, their mouths sewn shut with silver wire. They didn't attack. They simply drifted closer, their eyeless sockets fixed on his moving lips. One of them drifted into his path, and as Elias let out a sharp gasp of air, the entity's sewn mouth tore open. It mimicked the sound of his gasp, but amplified it into a sonic boom that cracked the outer pane of his mask. Cold water began to seep into his eyes. Elias clamped his jaw shut, forcing himself to breathe in slow, mechanical silence. He remembered the second rule. The breath of man is a trespass. He realized then that the tongue of the stone was total, absolute silence. The moment he stopped making noise, the faces receded into the limestone, merging back into the rock like oil into water. The shaft opened into a cathedral-sized cavern, but something was wrong with the physics. He felt a sudden, violent buoyancy. Despite his heavy steel tanks and 15 pounds of lead weights, he began to float upward with terrifying speed. He looked up. The ceiling wasn't rock. It was a shimmering liquid mirror that looked like molten silver. He saw dozens of skeletons pinned against it, men in rusted chainmail and tattered robes, their bones white and clean, floating as if they were bubbles of air trapped against a window. Carry the weight of the fallen. Elias saw a discarded iron reliquary resting on a ledge 50 feet below him. He clawed at the water, fighting the upward pull that felt like an invisible hand dragging him toward the silver ceiling. His depth gauge was screaming. It read 400 feet, then 500, but his body was telling him he was ascending. If he hit that ceiling, he'd be pinned there forever like the knights of the Ordo Umbrae. He reached the ledge, his fingers scraping against the stone, and grabbed the iron box. It was impossibly heavy, filled with leaden seals and ancient coins. The moment he hugged it to his chest, his buoyancy neutralized. He sank. He walked along the floor of the cave, burdened by the dead weight of a medieval cult, his knees buckling under the artificial gravity of the room. He was a diver, but he was now a pilgrim, trekking across a landscape that was no longer Algeria. The cathedral ended in a narrow aperture that glowed with a sickly bioluminescent green. Elias reached for his primary light to check the clearance, but he stopped. Offer no light to the shadows. He looked ahead. The passage was filled with millions of tiny hair-like filaments hanging from the ceiling, swaying in a current that shouldn't exist. They were sensitive to photons. When his light brushed one, it flared red and let out a high-pitched shriek that vibrated through his bones. He did the unthinkable. He reached up and clicked off his primary light. Then his backup. Then the glowing HUD of his computer. He was in absolute crushing darkness. He navigated by touch, his gloved hands sliding over the cold, wet stone. He felt the filaments brush his hood like ghostly fingers tasting his presence. In the darkness, he heard the low Gregorian chant of the Ordo Umbrae, their voices coming from the water itself, singing praises to the golden weaver who waited below. The water was no longer water. It was thicker now, like oil, coating his suit in a slick, viscous film. He felt the pressure changing, not the pressure of depth, but the pressure of a different reality pressing in on his skin. Elias emerged into the final chamber. He didn't need a light here. The room was illuminated by a pulsating golden light that seemed to bleed from the very air. In the center of the void hung the Weaver. It was a massive, multi-dimensional entity that looked like a spider made of woven light and suns. Its legs were the golden threads of fate, stretching out into the dark corners of the universe. It was the god the cultists had found, a cosmic interloper that used the cave as its web. Elias saw his own life reflected in the Weaver's threads. He saw his birth, his first dive, and he saw his body at the altar 400 feet above, already mummified by a time that didn't exist here. He realized the cave didn't lead down into the earth. It led out of it. He remembered the fourth rule: do not look upon the golden weaver. He squeezed his eyes shut until his lids ached. He felt the weaver's presence, a vast, cold curiosity. A golden thread brushed against his regulator, a sound like a harp string being plucked. The weaver wanted him to look. It wanted him to witness the majesty of the portal, to become part of the tapestry of the Ordo Umbrae. Elias focused on the weight in his arms, the iron reliquary. He focused on the silence in his throat. He kicked his fins, moving toward the only thing left: a cold, dark drain at the bottom of the weaver's nest. He felt a sudden, violent shift in pressure, a sensation of being turned inside out. The water vanished. He fell. He hit a surface that felt like cold sand. He opened his eyes, gasping for air that was dry and smelled of frankincense and old vellum. He stood up, his dive gear feeling absurdly heavy in the absence of water. He was in a vaulted hall filled with thousands of candles. Men in dark, hooded robes stood in silent rows, their faces hidden. They weren't ghosts. They were a living continuity of the cult, existing in a pocket of time that the world had forgotten. One of the hooded figures stepped forward and held out a hand, gesturing for the reliquary. Elias looked back at the small, shimmering pool behind him, the portal he had fallen through. It looked like a simple puddle on the floor. He realized he wasn't in Algeria anymore. He was in a place where the 14th century had never ended, a sanctuary built in the cracks of the world. He had followed the rules, and in doing so, he had ceased to be a diver. He was a new initiate, and the descent into their secrets was only just beginning.